Well, good morning to you all. I have to admit I got hay fever this morning, so I got runny eyes, which make some things a bit more difficult. Anyway, forward and upward. Thank you for joining me on this first horological online discussion on David Ramsay. But first, I thought I'd try and tell you a little bit about myself. I graduated in natural sciences from Corpus Christi College, Cambridge in June 1959 and applied to do a PhD in geology in Antarctica. But the government cut the funding after my sponsorship had been agreed. And that was the end of my thoughts of an academic career. So I've done no personal research, academic research on clockmakers, rely on the work of others. And in particular, these references you have here before you, I've used these in this talk today. I'm dyslexic and I grew up with problems with reading, and I think that's a blessing, not a curse, because you have to find your way around doing things so that I notice things beyond the written world because I have to. Blessing is not a curse. It makes you see the world in a different light to other people. No formal engineering training, I'm just self-taught, and from an early age I was fascinated how to make things. So this is my interest in David Ramsay, into basically how you make the bits and pieces that he did 400 years ago. And David Ramsay was the fourth son of George Margaret Ramsay, and there's no copy of his baptism record has been found so far. But David was born in about 1580 at Langeraw Farm, which is just off the road south from St Andrews to the Forth Estuary. And David was apprenticed on the 24th of May, 1594, to Henry Smith. And Henry Smith was later appointed to the as the Royal Armourer of King James VI of Scotland. And so creating a sword, a defensive breastplate, or a pistol barrel required steel of a higher caliber than used by a cooper to make a barrel hoop or a blacksmith to make a horseshoe. Thus David's training not only included hardening and tempering steel, but also smelting the iron ore itself to obtain a more pure, uniform quality, higher quality of steel. This required finding, purchasing, and processing the highest purity raw materials to produce a superior grade of steel. This background of smelting, quality control, finishing, and engraving would serve David well in the future. There's no record of any horological training that he received. He appears just to pick it up, possibly in Paris. King James loved the theatre of dressing up. And here he is in a full set of armor. I wonder whether David was involved in the construction of it. And although the king loved the theatre, he never actually wore armor to lead his troops into battle. It got more sense. And if you want to get ahead, get a hat. How's that for a hat? And of course, wear a sword. So as I mentioned, the steel for a sword or a breastplate or a barrel needed to be of the highest quality, because he didn't want the sword breaking or the breastplate buckling and the arrow going through, or firing from their pistol exploding in your face. And beyond that, the iron couldn't be too hard, or it would be difficult to cut grooves into the surface if you were doing the damasking of hammering the metal in. And Jacobean sword hilts then required this very soft, very pure iron and the gold and silver to go with it. This sword was probably owned by King James, and it's in the armory in Windsor Castle, and you can see the damasking in this black and white photograph all over the surface, where the steel has been scored and then the gold and silver have been rolled to lock the precious metal into the surface of the steel. And all teenagers enjoy having a fancy dress, and how better could you dress up as the Prince of Wales than beat your friends by turning up in a proper suit of armor. Again, I wonder whether David was involved in making this. And David is primarily known as a watchmaker, but in the Victorian Albert Museum, there's this lovely table clock which has been preserved. And it's interesting because it's engraved on all the four sides, and you can see the little silver plaques for the four evangelists. And on the first side, you've got the symbol of St. Matthew, the evangelist, symbolized by a winged man or angel. And you can see in the painting, there's the angel sending his inspiration to St. Matthew, whereas in the engraving here, you can see the angel is holding up the book while St. Matthew writes in it. And in the engraving on the clock, rather than on the plaque, you've got the two little cherubs balancing a sand glass on their heads, and they've got their hand onto a skull. So the time and mortality is represented in the background there. The second evangelist, of course, is St. Mark, and his symbol is a winged lion representing strength. And in the engraving on the clock, on the side, there are two terms which are ladies whose lower half has been turned to stone. I don't think I'll make a joke about that, but in this engraving, you can see the terms are sprouting out from a bowl of fruit surrounded by the foliage. Whereas in the center, in the engraving, the lion there looks more like a pet dog than a fierce lion. And I'm sure that Mark, writing his gospel, twisting around like that, is going to get a terrible crick in his back. So moving on to Luke, the third side of the clock. His symbol is the ox, and you can see him leaning over the shoulder in the painting there. And the ox is a figure of sacrifice, service, and strength. Whereas on the clock, you've got a set of engravings of fawns, and not quite sure what they've got to do with the symbol of strength. But hidden in it's difficult to see within the silver that the eagle, his symbol, is behind him, looking away from him, looking towards him. And it's thought by the ancients that the eagles were special because they could look straight into the sun and didn't mind the sun in their eyes. So those are the four sides of the clock, but on the bottom of the clock, there's a hidden picture. And hidden on the base here, you've got what should we say? It's the Pope having his nose put to the grindstone, and the V&A website gives the notes. First of all, it says place of origin Scotland, movement, comma made, France, case, comma made. And what is known is that David was in Paris in 1610, but I find it hard to believe this engraving was performed in France with all its anti-papist sentiment. The V&A notes here, they point out that there's the Pope with his nose against the grindstone, and it's been watched by King James, aided by his two sons, Henry and Charles. And the grindstone is turned by two Protestant clergy, and the scene is watched in horror by the Catholic cardinal and the three Catholic friars. But to me, the biggest mystery is, who are the two gentlemen with bigger hats than the king himself? And James is also shown with the crown, which is not the crown of Scotland. You can see the heraldic version of the crown, that the cross on top has got pearls in it, and the supports are metal, whereas in the king picture, the cross on top of the orb doesn't have any pearls, but there are pearls on the support. So I think it's a different crown, particularly when you notice where the fleur-de-lis is, because the fleur-de-lis is in between the two supports with a cross on the support. So if we go then to the crown of England, the crown of St. Edward, traditionally this was used to crown British and English monarchs since the 13th century. And you can see there, this has the same crown on top and the same ornamentation with the pearls, and it's got the same band supports of crosses and with the fleur-de-lis in between them. The crown itself was sold by Cromwell and melted down after Parliament abolished the monarchy in 1649 during the Civil War. And so that the crown used today, or slightly in the future, to crown King Charles III, if that's what is going to be his name, is in fact a replica which was rebuilt for Charles' restoration, Charles II's restoration. But going back, who are the other two gentlemen in the picture? They both got bigger hats than the king, so they are considered more important in the picture. And could the one with the crown on the right refer to Frederick V, the Elector of Palatine on the Rhine in the Holy Roman Empire from 1610 to 1623, because he actually arrived on the 16th of October 1612 to begin negotiations with King James to marry his daughter Elizabeth. And Frederick's suit succeeded, and they were married on the 14th of February 1613, and they reigned as the King and Queen of Bohemia from 1619 to 1620, when a small invasion ended their rule. But I have not even a suggestion as who the left-handed man in the picture with the biggest hat of all might be. So any suggestions, please? Answers on a postcard. In the early 1620s, King James was having negotiations with the sorry, I lost my place. King James was having his negotiations to marry off Prince Charles to the Spanish Infanta, and a version of holding the nose of the Pope to the grindstone appeared against this match, and the pamphlet had to be suppressed in London because it was embarrassing to the king, who was trying to create an alliance then with Catholic Spain. So I think we were lucky that this clock with its hidden engraving underneath was not suppressed as well. But the clock itself, on the other side, has an incredible piece of engraved basket top. Imagine how you would make such a piece when you had to make your own drill bits, make your own piercing saws, and making your own files to create such a masterpiece as this. The fineness of the wonderful swirls of the foliage, they're only fractions of a millimeter in size, and a few strokes of a file and they would disappear. But it's certainly a masterpiece, isn't it? What I find sad is this lovely little clock has lost its hour hand, and it's difficult for a person viewing the clock to realize it's a clock at all. And I can never understand the museum's thought processes in these things. They'd rather show something they know is missing a vital piece than replace the hour hand to make the clock visible as a clock, and then put a note nearby that the hour hand has been replaced. What's almost bad in my mind is if the hour hand had been replaced by a nasty, cheap Victorian hour hand, museums would leave this misleading travesty as, oh, it's all part of the object's rich history. I think David Ramsay will be turning in his grave not to have an hour hand on his clock. At the other end of the size spectrum is this little watch. And David is known more as a watchmaker than a clockmaker. And I think this is absolutely beautiful. Again, the detail in this octagonal watch in the engraving is well, beautiful. And the dial was engraved in about 1610. And it's smaller than a good old-fashioned penny. If you have even a modern little penny these days, they've gone out of fashion as well, haven't they? But in this tiny, tiny little silvered center, you've got a church by a river with a village and houses. And they got the river bank, you see the river flying by, and then near to us we have a willow tree, and then the sun is shining from the cloud and the sunbeams are coming down onto the little village. I think it's a charming little scene, and this little watch was probably worn by a princess or a wealthy lady, hung from a ribbon around her neck. But in watches, Ramsay's pièce de résistance is his King James watch. It really is the most fantastic piece of not only engineering, but of presentation and design. And when the COVID-19 lockdown ends, I'll hope you'll go and see King James's watch, which is on show in the small exhibition in the National Museum in the Isle of Man, the Manx Museum in Douglas. And inside the front cover, when you open it, you've got the King James VI Royal Coat of Arms, and it's surrounded by his motto, blessed are the peacemakers, coming from Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. And then inside the bottom cover, there's a picture of the king himself. And around his portrait, it's in Latin, Mighty James, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, Ireland and Scotland, defender of the faith. And then if you look at the gold, you'll see that it's signed David Ramsay, may Scottays fake it. and I'm told by Latin scholars that the Scotaise is a Latin spelling mistake. Well, I don't think that we would have noticed, possibly, not many of us have anything to do with Latin these days, but David himself, of course, was likely educated in the grammar school in St Andrews, where he would certainly have had a good grounding in Latin and known that this was wrong if he'd been about when it was being done. So is this another suggestion that when he was in England, this actual watch was being made in France? And the anonymous engraving, which was published in London, seems to be used by Gerard de Heck to do the engraving on the watch. The details of the right down to his medallion around his neck are identical. The engraver obviously thought he didn't have enough room to put his hat on. And that's Gerald de Heck. So I've now got a video to show you the detail of how the clock actually works. It's got 6 functions, which is amazing to me, and it puts completely in the shade all these modern complicated watches which everybody's so keen to produce and buy these days. So I hope you'll enjoy the video, and I'll be back to you as soon as it's finished.
Ramsay, the king's clockmaker. He was born in Fife, Scotland, around 1580, and he became the chief clockmaker to James VI of Scotland and the first of England in about 1613. But this appointment also included being a gentleman of the bedchamber, an inner cabal of Scots within the English court, reducing the influence of the Privy Council, who were primarily English, on the king. Astronomical King James VI and First's watch by David Ramsay, made in about 1618. The engraved portrait of King James VI and the First, the royal coat of arms, bear all the markings that this watch was commissioned by the king as a gift. It's an extraordinary piece of engineering, craftsmanship, and presentation for 7 separate features. The watch is a multi-featured device that does so much more than just tell the time. Opening the watch to show the dial, we've got the time, the day of the week, the zodiac, the date, the moon's age, the moon's phase, and the planetary hour. It's a bit difficult to take these all in, but if we speed up time 3,600 times, so 1 second becomes 1 hour, it's much easier to see how all the different dials are read and work in relation to one another. The watch has an hour hand, but does not have a minute hand. To tell the time, we look at the position of this steel hour hand pointer on the silver chapter ring. The distance it has moved between the 2 numerals enables you to estimate the time in minutes after the past hour. And this estimation is also helped by the red half-hour markers marked with small red flowers. Can you tell the time now? Yes, it's 5:30. On the 9 side of the dial is the day of the week aperture. The detailed engraving is incredible on a disc, measuring only 19 millimeters in diameter. Imagine the craftsman making this by candlelight without magnifying spectacles. Every day of the week is represented by its ruling planet and the associated god. Sunday, we have Apollo with his golden laurel wreath and bow and arrow. Monday, the moon, Luna, with her crescent moon headpieces and her bow and arrow. Tuesday is Mars with his sword and shield. Wednesday, Mercury, wearing his winged hat, carrying his herald staff with the two entwined snakes. Thursday, we have Jupiter, the king of the gods, with his golden crown, lightning bolts, and trident. Friday is Venus, the goddess of love, carrying a small child, whereas Saturday, Kronos has his scythe and is carrying a dead child. Each hour of the day is also assigned a ruling planet by astrologers. Knowing the planetary hour would inform the viewer or his fortune teller when making important decisions. For example, Venus might indicate an hour for love, Mars with dealing with paperwork, and Jupiter for good luck and good company. The planet hour disk is geared directly to the hour hand. On the 3 side of the watch, we have the lunar date and the moon phase apertures. On the average, it circles between a new and full moon in 29.5 days. Here, it's only engraved for 29 days. The moon phase disk has 59 teeth, which are all filed by hand. See some smaller than the average. Here's a full lunar cycle, speeding from new, waxing to full, and waning back to new again. At the top of the watch is the date, the month, and the zodiac dial. The silver outer dial is engraved for 31 days. The date is read using the small blue fleur-de-lis, and the month and the zodiac are identified with the long pointer. The watch would have to be recalibrated several times over the course of the year to take into account the differences in the lengths of the months in the Gregorian calendar. Of course, when this watch was made, both England and Scotland still used the Julian calendar, where the year changed at the Feast of the Annunciation on March the 25th. All Catholic countries had adopted the Gregorian calendar. Does the gap in the months between December and January, showing the new year on the King's watch, give a further indication it was made in a Catholic country, likely in Paris? Here you can see the 12 zodiac signs engraved on the pierced golden dial. Can you read the date now? Yes, it's the 25th of November, my birthday. That the watch has survived at all is remarkable, but here it is ticking away, displaying more functions than most so-called modern complication watches. Truly, this watch, by the foremost watchmaker of his age, David Ramsay, is an item fit for a king and can still amaze and delight us some 400 years later.
There we go. I hope you enjoyed that. I think it's a most amazing watch. What I was very surprised was a few months ago, I saw this watch signed Simon Bartam, who is probably Simon Bartram, who was born in 1598, almost a generation after David, who was born in 1580. And I can't get my mind around how similar these watches are, not only mechanically, but also in their layout and their engraving. And who did Simon Bartram get to buy this watch? Because he was a very young man at this time. He'd only just shortly come out of his apprenticeship. And the King James watch is dated mainly by the case and the engraving of Gerard Heck. But this watch is in a crystal case, which was a replacement made in the 150 years ago. But if you look at the two watches side by side, they are remarkably similar. If you look at the Bartram watch on the right-hand side, there's the engraving of a scene with a river and little houses and trees in the background. Remind you of anything you've seen today? It certainly reminds me of the Ramsay watch. And the engraving on the day of the week dial, again, is incredibly similar between the two watches, which just happen to have the same sign to show the Apollo with his bow and arrow. And although the layout is similar, it's not identical, and you wouldn't expect it to be identical. And if you look at the dial of each, on the King James on the left, the little square by which you can synchronize the planetary hour with the clock hour comes right through the engraving of the 4. Whereas in the Bartram watch on the right-hand side, the position of the little square to do the adjustment is just clear. And everything is slightly in different places, although the details appear to be identical. And I wouldn't expect them to be the same because, of course, these were not made from drawings. They were not made from CAD principles. The watchmakers themselves, or the clockmakers, would make the wheels and then put them in the most convenient place to give the best engagement to the teeth, which had all been hand filed. And so that the position of the little arbor sticking out for the planetary hour could be anywhere around the pitch circle diameter. And so that to me, it's not a detail which shows any difference in the manufacture. But aren't they similar, the engravings and the layout? And the bottom plate is also very interesting. In the engraving, if you look at the B of Bartram and the D of David, the engraver is the same hand which has put the swirls and the deep embellishments onto the letters. And the fake it is also virtually identical in the two engravings. So the engraving and the layout is very similar, but even if you look in the movement, the pillars, for example, are identical in form. And these are beautiful, tiny, tiny little pillars, and generally never seen by anybody but the watchmaker. And look at the detail in the little cross hole with those tiny, tiny little lips. Well, it's only a wobble of the drill and it's destroyed. And yet there they are, beautifully made, beautifully preserved, over 400 years ago. But the layout is very similar, isn't it? So David himself was in the inner sanctum of the King James, and he was a member of the bedchamber, which was the inner cabal. But after he died and his son became King James, he was not such an intimate relationship with the king. And so that the king used him still as a member of the bedchamber, but sent him on trips such as the king's emissary to Scotland to try and smooth over the troubles arising from the introduction of the new Common Prayer Book. And unfortunately, King Charles slowly changed his patronage from Ramsay to Edward East, and the production of Ramsay's watches and so on in his workshop in Westminster slowly declined. And in 1631, King James was at odds with Parliament over taxation and short of money. And the clockmakers of London got together to support the grant of a full livery company, the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. They proposed David Ramsay as their first master, and their charter was then granted by Charles, who pocketed the £61 which the clockmakers had produced together. And I wonder what David pocketed in a brown envelope as his fixer fee, because David's appointment appears as a complete oxymoron, as the purpose of the company was to restrict foreign workers taking Londoners' jobs. And David himself was by definition a foreign worker, as he hadn't trained in London. David rarely attended any of the company's meetings, and meanwhile the king's relationship with Parliament went from bad to worse. It ended with the king trying to arrest 5 members of the Parliament for sedition and treason, and they were to be arrested with members of the army and the king arriving in Parliament and forcing their way in. And the 5 members had got warning that this was going to happen, and they slipped out through a side door. And so that you then see the speaker, Mr. Lenthall, who's kneeling before King Charles, and he says, "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as this house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here." And since this incident on the 4th of January 1642, no sovereign has ever entered the Commons chamber since. Well, things continued to get from bad to worse, and the Civil War started, and David Ramsay, like a lot of people in those days, lived on tick from his creditors. And of course, as soon as the king was involved in the Civil War, they thought they weren't going to get paid, and so he was sued and thrown into jail, even though the king owed him over £2,000, £2,000 in those days, for goods and unpaid salary, and he was thrown into the debtor's prison. And after the defeat of the king and his in the various battles, and finally his capture and execution, the whole of the London clock trade was hit by recession, and David, to get his best debts paid, was still stuck in jail. And when Oliver Cromwell came to power and became Lord Protector, he set about this, trying to track down and get returned all the gifts that the king had given away. And he did a bargain with David in jail, and he offered him 33 1/3% of the proceeds of any of the king's possessions that he could track down, and Cromwell could then sequestrate, I think is the word, and get back. And then he auctioned them off, and 1/3 of the proceeds went to David. And to pay his debts and get out of jail, David had no option but to abandon his loyalty to his previous royal employer and help Cromwell. The recession then, after the death of the king, the whole of the London clock trade was hit, and the patrons and customers all melted away. Nevertheless, David remained openly staunch royalist throughout the protectorate of Cromwell, thereby exacerbating his impecunious state. And as ex-master of the Clockmakers' Company in 1652, aged 67, Ramsay turned up for a meeting and voting himself a grant from what little funds were left in the Clockmakers' Company coffers. David passed away in 1659 in the midst of the chaos after Cromwell's death and the complete breakdown of the protectorate headed by Oliver Cromwell's son, Richard, soon to be known as Tumbledown Dick. Richard was such a likable, ineffective character that no retribution was meted out against him personally from the restored dynasty. Of course, went to great lengths to dig up some of the perpetrators of the execution of the king, such as Cromwell, and put their heads on spikes. So meanwhile, poor old David didn't live long enough to survive to see a Stuart king restored, and he died a virtual pauper, still maintaining his lifelong royal loyalty. David's death left his wife, Sarah, a widow, but his will left her very little else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And that was fabulous. I hope that everyone really enjoyed that presentation and found it stimulating. So I just wondered if anyone had any questions. I'd like to hand over to Kristen, if I may. Kristen, I'm just going to unmute you. Hi there. Kristen, I just wondered if you'd received any questions. I noticed we've got 4 things in the chat. Also, if anybody would like to ask a question now, please just wave and we can unmute you.
Yes, you're welcome to wave, or you can put it in the group chat. I'll field it either way. First of all, just thank you to Dr. Taylor for the presentation. It's just always so interesting to learn more about these rather shadowy figures from the early history of clockmaking. Did anyone have any burning questions? Because I'm happy to proceed. I did get one observation from Jonathan Hills Dr. Taylor, who he observes that the case of the Ramsay clock in the V&A appears to be very similar to those produced in Augsburg at the same time, and particularly the enameled silver dial center. Do you have any observations on that, the similarity to those produced in Augsburg?
Well, Jonathan is one up on me, because I've been trying to get pictures out of the V&A of this particular watch for a period, and I'm also then been told, well, there aren't any good pictures, so that I can't really comment. Yes, I think it's remarkable what international trade took place. One tends to think that in our middle of our lockdown, that this is what took place when all the wars were going on in Europe and so on. Well, apart from the professional armies, I think life went on fairly normally for normal people. And a lot of travel took place and cooperation, and they knew much more about each other than I think we even do today. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if continental parts end up in a London watchmaker's production. And there were so many then foreign workers working in London, primarily in these enclaves, which were left over from the ecclesiastical period, when the guilds and the City of London had no jurisdiction over the ecclesiastical establishments. And even after the Reformation started by Henry VIII, these areas in London retained this same immunity. And so that Ramsay was using the immunity around Westminster Abbey, and Edward East had a factory in Ram Yard, which was also another of these places where the London guilds had no authority. And so you got the two masters of the Clockmakers Company doing exactly what the Clockmakers Company was set up to stop, which was the foreign workers working in London undercutting the London members' guilds' prices and their monopolies. So yes, it was quite likely that there would be things coming across from the continent into London, and I've no reason to think that this didn't happen.
Does anyone have any other questions? Ah, here comes something. So what was the planet hour today, Mercury, at 11 a.m.? Is what Joa has asked. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Taylor?
Yeah. Yes, it certainly does. I must admit I don't hold these things at hand, but if you put in Google, what is the planetary hour at 11 o'clock today, I'm sure you'll be able to find out what it was. And then
I wanted to know on your watch, John.
And then you'll be able to know whether it's safe for dalliance or signing documents, or but you must find out the planetary hour first.
Okay, is there any...
I'd love to look at it on the watch, but of course it's in the museum, in the Manx Museum in Douglas, and I don't think it'll be being wound, so it won't be ticking away at the moment.
I'll ask you again next time.
Let's see, I think we have time for a couple more questions. If nothing's coming in, it's interesting, you were talking about the trade and the synergy between different makers. I was wondering if possibly you could elaborate on what you think about this shadowy time that David Ramsay was in France, and possibly what his relationship was like with workshops or makers in Paris. What do we know about that? And what are your observations on that period, since he's often linked to?
You're going back over 400 years, and we don't know anything about Shakespeare, who was writing stuff all the time and had the written word, and his words are preserved, but when he actually wrote them, or even if he actually wrote them, is still in dispute. So that somebody like David Ramsay, who's not involved entirely. Goodness me, that wasn't my stomach, honestly. Did nobody else hear the noise? So that the knowledge of what has been, where Ramsay went and why, is still lost in the mists of time. I think that the features of the King's Watch, first of all, the spelling mistake in the name, shows that David wasn't there when the engraving was done, and the use of the gap between December and January, that is a Gregorian feature, because of course the Julian calendar, which was being used in England and Scotland, was the 25th of March, Ladies' Day. And so that most dates, if you look back into that period, if it was the 1st of February, they would put 1667 or 1668, because in the two calendars, they're in different years. They're the same month, they're the same day, they're the same date, but they're in different years. So that the cooperation on some things, as simple as what the date was, didn't take place, and there's very little literature to show anything about David's history. He's even less than Shakespeare, and it's a similar age, the beginning of the 1600s. So unfortunately, there is no information that anybody's been able to find, and the three researchers who did the most of the work on this, the Finches, they have been unable to unearth a great deal as to what happened to David in Paris.
Thanks for that. I believe Richard Grosny has a question. I'll hand it over to you, Richard, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I've just unmuted. Thank you. Thank you very much for that talk, John. That was fascinating. Complemented very nicely what some of us heard you say when at the Manx Museum, what seems like an age ago, but was only early this year when your exhibition opened. Your mystery fellow with the tall hat, I just wondered, has anyone looked at the possibility of it being the King of Denmark, who I think was, note here, Christian IV, because he was King James's brother-in-law, and meant to keep in close touch with them. He was over a few years earlier than your clock, but I suppose he conceivably could have come back. Now, he didn't have a crown on his head, which makes that a bit intrinsically unlikely, but he was painted once or twice without a crown on his head and with pretty exotic headgear. Anyway, people may have thought of it, but I throw it into the pot.
Good, thank you very much. Well, we'll have to do more investigations.
Can I ask a question? Well, a question, it's more of an observation.
Yeah,
over the years, I've repaired one or two various vergers, especially I did a Tomping a few years ago. I've got two Arnolds in at the present, and looking at that unit today, the kudos the actual watchmaker's taken, there's endless skills, because the similarities between the ones I've just mentioned and the ones we've just seen, they must have been cottage industry making lots and lots of parts for what the so-called clock or watchmakers.
Yes, I'm sure that's it was brought to perfection by Tompion, wasn't it?
That's right.
That he got round the restrictions of the clockmakers company by employing these outworkers. Fromenteel got round them by setting up a factory in Southwark. The clockmakers company likes to picture itself as being the preservation of quality and fair wages in London, but they also hounded their junior members for money for fees and dues, whereas some of the hierarchy, particularly David Ramsay and Edward East, for example, flaunted the rules of the company by employing their Huguenot workers outside the jurisdiction of the London guilds. So it is a funny state of affairs with the employment taking place in those days in London.
Well, I think, yeah, if you pick a watch up from Glasgow or from London or from, I know the French are slightly different, but there's still a lot of similarities. Even in those days, they must have been some form of communication, other than the internet, of course, to be able to follow it.
Yes, absolutely. We tend to think that the world is a very large place in the olden days, and people didn't travel and they didn't get around, but they certainly did, and they did travel, and they even took traveling clocks with them, with alarms to get them up in the morning to catch the next coach. It is a myth that in the middle of all the wars which took place in the continent over this period, that travel didn't take place. It certainly did, and you're right that information passed not only from around London, but also around London and the continent. And I'm sure parts were made by specialists. It was not before the investigation onto making pins that it was a cost saving if each person did an individual operation, but the specialization in making parts took place very early, and I say it was brought to perfection by Tompion, who not only had parts made, but I'm sure complete sub-assemblies. But how he got everything to work together, that's what I think is the skill. And without modern drawings and CAD methods and so on to tie everything together, it's difficult to understand how he could make everything of quality and stop it degenerating his image, because every clock and watch made by Tompion that survived, if it was a genuine one, that is quality, which you can't say for a lot of the other makers.
That's right. What I've noticed is that one of the Arnolds I've got in at the present, the pinion gears are absolutely perfect, but some of the wheels are a bit crude. So obviously they've been made in different areas by different people.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm sure it took place, because how Tompion could make 600 clocks and over 5,000 watches, that's a huge production effort, far exceeding virtually everybody else put together.
That's right.
And if I could just jump in, I think we just have time for one quick question. And on this theme of specialization, Andrew Maloney asked, did David really have to make all his own tools, like the files, for those tiny teeth?
Well, even in my lifetime, apprentices coming into the engineering trade, particularly tool making, they had to make their own set squares, their own dividers, as part of their training. And I think that the specialized producers, I don't think there's any evidence that there was a catalog and you could go around and buy a file from a particular man down the street. And so that certainly in his apprenticeship, he would have made all his own tools, because that took place in my lifetime. So I don't think it would be any different in an apprenticeship 400 years ago. You didn't have the money to go and buy things. You made them yourself. And in the making, you learnt the tools of your trade. And I'm sure that this was what happened with David.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sorry, I will have to wind it up. We could probably go on much longer than this, but thank you again, Dr. Taylor, for sharing your expertise on Ramsay and the several of the royal watches, and in particular the King James I portrait watch. I'm going to turn things back over now to Tina to close the proceedings, but thank you very much for your questions. And again, thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you for all attending, and it's been my pleasure. Thank you.